Your objective today is to observe value changes in the landscape and use the correct value of a color from your color scheme to paint the landscape. We're working with analogous colors. These are the analogous colors that I've chosen to work with: magenta, red violet, and red orange. I've mixed magenta, red violet, and red orange in my palette, and I then mixed them into some of the different values. I picked lighter tints of the red orange, a shade of the red violet, and then tints of magenta. So if I have them all mixed up in my palette and ready to go, it's much easier than to keep mixing and then painting and mixing and painting. The image I'm working with, I've already traced it onto paper. I used really dark lines so that it shows up better in the video. You should try to trace it a little lighter so that the paint covers over it easier. I've numbered the different values according to how they look next to the grayscale. This being the lightest, a little bit darker, a little darker, and so on. Some things, like this shape, is mostly a value number 5 with tiny little pieces of darker number 6 in it. I'm not going to label and outline all of those little shapes though, because it's going to be a lot easier to do that with the brush later on. For me, it's easier to do the light values first and the dark values last, and also best when you're painting to go from the background and paint that first into the foreground. If I paint this whole sky first, it's going to be a lot easier to paint that rock formation on top of it. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to choose my palette. I'm going to choose the lightest value of the red-orange and paint the sky area. If I happen to go over a little rock formation like right there and go over the line right now, it doesn't matter, because when this paint is dry, I'll be painting this 3 value right on top of it. I can be more careful then. Right now I'm going to block in this whole shape. So in my little palette here, you can see how this is there's some little variations in the value. That's okay. It's a painting after all. It doesn't have to be a totally flat color. It can be how you want it to be. So that was the one area at the top that had number 1 value. On the bottom, I'm going to choose a different number 1 value. I think I'm going to go with the magenta for that, so that it looks more watery. Rinse out the brush, dry off the brush. Remember, you always want to dry off your brush. If you keep water in your brush, then it'll lighten up your colors and make them even lighter than you intended. So this water is, again, behind these rock formations. So if I paint over some of those outlines, if I'm not really careful about getting around them, it's going to be okay, because later on with the brush, I can go back on top and get super fine precision with the darker value. A darker value is going to cover a light value much easier than a light value covers a dark. While I'm painting this, I want to add that if there's something else that you want to add to the landscape, I don't know, like a dog sitting on the rock, throwing a tree, a flower, something like that, you can take your artistic license and your creativity and add something in there, although that is not required of this lesson. Okay, so now I've got my light values blocked in. So I could now go up and do this 2 value, and I'm going to choose to stick with the red orange. Yeah, I'll stick with that. Red orange. Here in the palette, I've already got it mixed in. So now I can paint right on top of where I had that sky in the background. So you can see how the brown of the colored pencil is still showing through this paint. If you add enough paint, that's going to disappear. It'll cover up. But for you, if you want to avoid that, trace lightly. That's really the only shape that uses a number 2 value. Except here in the water, there's some little dots of darker value that I can add on top. So here's one trick you can do. If you want some unusual little shapes like that, you can dip into the darker value, kind of dab your brush a little, and instead of trying to get those shapes exactly the same way, you can do a little freestyling. Just dab some different kinds of shapes in there. Okay, it doesn't have to be exactly like the picture. It's your art piece after all. You're making your own image the way that you want it to be. So next, I'm going to get a number 3. Let's say that's this red orange. No, it's not. That's a 2 value. Well, let me add the 3 in here. And I talked about doing this when we did just the value scales and the color wheel. Sometimes you can just go back into the wet paint, add a little bit of that color, and while the paint is still wet, you can kind of blend it into what you've already got on there. You wind up seeing the brush strokes. It gives it a little bit of texture, and it looks nice. Okay, I can keep with orange, or maybe I can go back to magenta or the red violet. I'm going to choose the magenta. Paint some magenta mountain or rock formations. Here you can see the brush stroke because magenta is a little bit thin paint, and you can kind of see right through to the paper. So you can add some thicker paint on top, or if you like how that looks, just leave it. If you jab your brush on the paper like this, you'll get, again, some intentional texture, and maybe that's something you'll want to think about doing for a rock formation because it's a rough texture surface. As I'm doing that, even though I don't see it in this photocopy, I'm going to add a little bit more darkness to that 4 area by adding some red violet in there. And maybe a little bit more over here. Little red violet into the magenta area. Okay. When this is dry, I might not be satisfied with it. Maybe I want to paint on top of it, change a color or two. But this is just the beginning of my analogous painting. I'm sticking with the same values, and I'm still using all of my analogous colors. So I'm going to stop now to put these colors away, and I want to save them for tomorrow because I want to keep painting this painting. I'm going to dip that paper towel into the water so that it kind of keeps a little bit of damp moisture inside the palette. Put the lid on, and then store that away where my palette goes.